remind me. Okay, so when I started working on the history of the Gundas, the first question which I was alerted about by one of my JNU professors was that in order to do a PhD, in order to do historical research, one had to say something new. And in order to say something new, where do we find information which we can use in order to add to the existing body of knowledge? And that way, I was guided to the archives. And when I went to the archives, initially I had difficulties in finding primary sources on the Gundas of Calcutta. And then I found a wealth of information at the West Bengal State Archives here in Calcutta. These are confidential files of the Calcutta police of the early 20th century, at the time when Charles Taggart was the commissioner of Calcutta police, and he was heroically leading Calcutta police at a time when the police was actually in the throes of crisis in terms of manpower, in terms of equipment, in terms of the money that it had been allocated by the colonial government. And I found that it was necessary at that point for any researcher, and as well as somebody who was doing doctoral research into that area, to frame a central question. And the central question I framed after having been through the archives for about a year was, how did a certain class of a certain section of people of the city come to be known as the Gundas? They weren't committing crimes which were in any possible way new. They were committing the same kind of crimes which were witnessed in Calcutta before the arrival of the Gundas. And so that led me to the question of what made the public fear them as Gundas, as somebody who, as a section of criminals who were different from ordinary criminals. And they were called extraordinary criminals by the British at that point in time. And when the Gundas Bill was passed in the Bengal Legislative Council back in February 1923, they were termed extraordinary criminals as opposed to ordinary criminals. And people who took part in the debate said that we don't need a definition for the Gundas because Gundas are extraordinary criminals. They evoke extraordinary amount of fear, which is why we can easily identify a Gunda and distinguish a Gunda from, for example, a thief or a robber who's a common criminal who do not evoke the kind of fear that the Gunda does. And essentially, I found that I was basically working more on the fear of crime than crime itself. Crime becomes, from this point for me as a researcher, it became rather a matter of perception. A matter of perception in the sense, a matter of perception of one's own physical security and the security of property in the city. And that's how my research progressed. When I concluded this research, I wanted to work on something offbeat. And I had come across a book which I believe many of you have read. It's called Religion and the Decline of Magic. It's by a British historian, British Marxist historian called Keith Thomas. Keith Thomas talks about the rise of Protestantism in England during the 17th century and how magic was banished from the realm of religion. And Protestantism propagated a kind of religious belief which was very practical. It was a worldview which was very practical, very scientific, and very matter-of-factly, in which anything magical, anything that was inexplicable didn't have much of a space. And slowly magic got banished from the realm of religion. This is what he talked about. But interestingly, when he finishes the book, Keith Thomas says that there was about a 200-year-old period between the 17th century and the actual decline of magic, when magic got completely banished from... Yes, please? Okay. When magic gets completely banished from religion or the other areas of public life. Interestingly, I wanted to work on magic and I was finding it difficult to find sources. And at that point in time, I found a book at the National Library of India, which is in Calcutta over here, not far from here. It's called The Myth of the Mystique East. And this was published in 1934 by a Scottish doctor called Robert Henry Elliot. Robert Henry Elliot is an ophthalmologist, and he is known for his work on glaucoma, and he was posted in different areas of colonial India, and he has a hospital named Eye Hospital named after him, which is currently in Chennai, earlier Madras. So he wrote this book towards the end of his life. He died in 1936, and he wrote this book in order to challenge that a notion that was gaining ground, especially in the West, that India was essentially the magical land that one can look for. The world itself was becoming very modern from the 18th century onwards. And one aspect of modernity which becomes remarkably noticeable from the 18th century is that magic, from being a mechanism of warding off evil, from being a mechanism of fighting with fears of the unknown, becomes a form of entertainment. And by the 19th century, a very interesting development takes place, and which is around 1840s. A watchmaker in France called Jean-Eugène Robert, and he added his wife's surname to his surname, so he became Jean-Eugène Robert Houdin, spelled Houdin. And he, after having tried his hat at watchmaking and then at machine making, took to magic. And in the process, he revolutionized magic itself. He revolutionized magic in the sense that he turned magic into a scientific experiment meant for popular recreation. And he termed his shows scientific soiree, and his audience was mainly the Parisian bourgeois of the 1840s. During 1848, during the revolution of 1848, when all the theaters of Paris were closed, he took his show off to London, and he became very famous over there. And slowly, he became turned into almost a cult figure of the mid-19th century. And effectively, he started what became later on he didn't start, or rather he contributed majorly to the making of the modern entertainment industry, global entertainment industry. And his magic traveled first, with his shows, his magic traveled first to England, then from England to other parts of Europe, and then it went across the Atlantic. As European magicians went to the USA to put on shows over there. And at this point in time, very interestingly, the bourgeois audience who were flocking the theaters became interested in not only in popular scientific experiments, they became interested in watching cultural performances which came from non-European countries. And at this point, it's the time of the colonial empires. So at this point, the bourgeois were interested in magic of Asian and African countries. Initially, towards the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, there was a perceptible rising fancy about Egyptian magic. Slowly, that was replaced by Indian magic from around 1815, 1820s. By the 1830s, Indian magic had attained the status of fancy for those who had a scientific bent of mind. Particularly because people who traveled to India, Europeans who traveled to India, published anecdotes of Indian magic which they witnessed here in India, stating that it was impossible for to proffer any scientific explanation to what they had seen. And this belief was gaining ground. And one of the things which they had witnessed in India was levitation, in which a man practically defying the laws of gravity, floats in thin air in full public view. Robert Houdin, or Houdin, as he became later famous, he performed an act of levitation with the help of his son, Emile. Emile was only 5 years of age back then, so he had a metal contraption hidden in Emile's dress, and he made Emile rest his elbow on a stick, which was actually attached to that contraption hidden in his dress, apparently to make him float in thin air. And he became an overnight sensation with this act. And from this point on, it became possible for Europeans, without traveling to India, to witness Indian magic on the Western stage. And slowly, it became a rage all over Europe and America to witness Indian magic. Last year, the Library of Congress to work on this subject, and I was fascinated with newspaper advertisements which came out in American newspapers in the middle 19th and especially towards the end of the 19th century in larger numbers, calling attention to the fare that the magician had to offer, and these magicians were white American or European magicians. But what, the special attractions of their shows were something they called Hindu magic. Many a times this Hindu magic was spelled H-I-N-D-O, which actually shows how ignorant people were, I mean both the performer and the audience, of Hinduism, and what the term Hindu magic had actually nothing to do with India or Hinduism, the religion. But nonetheless, it became a marker of India. From around the middle of the 19th century, especially from 1870s onwards, many periodicals which came out from Britain and some in America regularly published articles or letters to the editor which claimed that India was essentially the proverbial magical land. Meaning that you can come to India and witness phenomena within performances by magicians which you cannot see anywhere else. And another thing was that these performances left the audience intrigued. The funny thing is, the magicians were itinerant street magicians who would perform, who would roam all over the country and nomadically and perform, put on a show right on the street in front of the people who had flocked around him, without any contraption, without any prop, and leave the audience intrigued in a matter of minutes. And so slowly there came up a debate among those who believed that India was truly a magical land, and those who believed that it was a hoax which was perpetrated by people who had been to India for sake of popularity. In 1890, something very interesting happened. A newspaper called Chicago Tribune published an account, an eyewitness account, written by an American who had been to India, who had witnessed what is now known as the Indian rope trick, in which basically what happens is the Indian magician, after chanting incantations, throws up a thick rope, which is a very long rope, which seemingly, defying the laws of gravity, hangs from thin air. And it's so long a rope that you can't see the tip of it, because it reaches almost to the sky and hides the clouds. If it's a cloudy day, you can't even see the tip of the rope, which climbs so high up in the sky. And then a boy assistant of the magician is told to climb up the rope. This boy climbs up the rope, and then he vanishes when he reaches the tip of the rope, but his voice could be caught, and then there's a theatrical performance of an altercation between the magician and this boy who's climbed up the rope and cannot be seen, can only be heard. Then after the magician feigns anger, he takes a sword and climbs up the rope. He climbs up the rope, and then there's a heated altercation which can be heard from above, and then pieces of flesh, gory flesh, fall from the sky. And apparently the magician, in a fit of anger, had killed this assistant, this little boy who had climbed up the rope. The magician then comes down, then he piles up these pieces, the pieces which he collects from the ground in a bag, and starts chanting incantations. At this minute, the boy appears unhurt from among the crowd, the flock of the people who have gathered around the magician to watch his performance. Now, this was published by a man called John Albert Wilkie. John Albert Wilkie started his career as a journalist. Initially, he started as a newspaper boy. He used to sell newspaper on the streets of Chicago, and then he turned into a reporter. And then he published this account. It was published in 1890. It was retracted about 6 months after its publication. It was a hoax. The Chicago Tribune was trying to sell more copies. It was trying to become the most popular newspaper of Chicago. It had to come up with some strategy with which it can attract the attention of its readers. And in 6 months, they retracted the story, telling that it was a hoax it was a story planted by one of their reporters who actually meant to intrigue people. And it was a trick. There was nothing harmful about it. But by this time, the belief had gained ground that the rope trick was something which you can actually go and watch in India. There were letters from all parts of from both sides of the Atlantic, sent to the Chicago Tribune and other newspapers of the time, who were hotly debating whether this is actually possible. We can actually go and watch the rope trick. And as a result of it, from the 1890s, the leading magicians of the period, including John Neville Maskelyne. John Neville Maskelyne is something like P.C. Chopra would be to Indian magic scene. That big a figure. I mean, he was an inventor, he was a magician, he was a watchmaker. He had a remarkable scientific bent of mind without having much formal education. And he left a legacy in the sense that his son and his grandson were famous magicians, and I believe his great-grandson became a movie star because he was good-looking, so he won fame on the stage and later started acting in movies. So John Neville Maskelyne set up a body, and he started publishing about what he used to term the hoax of Indian magic. There's a palpable sense of competition among which threatened the European magicians at this time and American magicians, who felt that their audiences who paid to watch their shows would go back home and say something like, look, had we been in India, we could have watched something much better, without the use of props, without the use of darkness, without the magician apparently fooling us. So this became a problem for them. So they started publishing first articles and then books. And then a few magicians who could travel to India actually traveled to India. They documented their travel pretty much the way anthropologists would do, and they published books which became very popular. And they stated over there that if you go to India, if you actually try to watch Indian magic, you'll see that there's nothing intriguing about it. It's rather simple. And the rope trick, they said, is a figment of imagination. They denied the existence of the rope trick. But that only fanned the fire. The belief that there was something like the rope trick, or the rope trick actually existed, had become so firm that in 1905, the Magic Circle of London started an inquiry into the thing. And in 1912, they contacted this doctor, Robert Henry Elliot, who was in India, to make inquiries, scientific inquiries, into the rope trick and whether the rope trick had ever existed. If it did, what was the trick behind it? How could it be performed? Robert Henry Elliot had been in Indian medical service, and he had traveled throughout the length and breadth of British India. He had been to Peshawar, he was posted in Peshawar, he was posted all the way down in Madras, present in Chennai. He had been to Burma, he had traveled through Bengal, he had traveled through Western India. So he wrote a book. He initially published a series of articles in the Magic Circular, which was the mouthpiece of the Magic Circle of London, which is the association of the leading magicians of the Western world, especially the British ones. And it was so elite an organization that they didn't let Houdini join it. And Houdini was very bitter about it. Now what happened when Robert Henry Elliot started writing is that the BBC in the 1930s became aware of this controversy, and they threw open a challenge to any magician who could come up and perform the rope trick in front of for them to report in the newsreel. And an English magician who called Abraham Derby, who went by the name of Karachi, dressing up in Indian robes and a turban. He looked absolutely British, in spite of what he thought would convince his audience that he was from India, but there was nothing Indian about it. And he performed the rope trick, in which he had steel pipes inserted in a thick rope. He made those steel pipes kind of with the help of a trick to stand erect for a few minutes. And the pipe and the rope would be something like 4 or 5 foot in height, and he made his son climb up the rope. That was the trick he played. The BBC filmed it. If you have a liking for it, you can watch it on YouTube these days, because these things have become free, I believe, and freely available, I believe. But you'll be very, very unimpressed because it's nothing of the rope trick, nothing like the rope trick which was written about in the periodicals and newspapers of England and America. So what happens as a result of it is that a very large number of people who had resided in India, mostly Britishers, started writing letters to editors. Like the BBC used to have a periodical called The Listener. And in the pages of The Listener, this thing was debated for months together. And I remember there was an English lady who was in Bengal, who was in Darjeeling, and who lived in certain other parts of India, who was here, who spent, I believe, her childhood in India because her father worked in India and the family resided over here. And I believe she grew up here and she moved to England when she was almost 20 years old. She said that she had witnessed the rope trick. Similarly, a man who'd been to Darjeeling and resided in Darjeeling said that he had witnessed the rope trick performed up in the hills, in which the boy practically vanishes in thin air and then reappears out of nowhere. And it's an inconclusive debate. Inconclusive debate meaning that Robert Henry Elliot dies in 1936. His book comes out in 1934, which are archival, his writings are archival material for me. I refer to those writings time and again. I've been through special issues of the numbers of the Magic Circular. There are other magicians periodicals of the period, namely the Mahatma, which came out of America, and the Sphinx, which was also published from America, which also routinely published at a certain point in time in the early 20th century, articles about Indian magic and especially the rope trick. And they also debate about the rope trick, and they say that the rope trick it's all in the mind. And Robert Henry Elliot, who was a doctor, he says that the climate of India is such that if you live here for a certain amount of time, you might end up seeing things. The heat, the moisture, the rains, there are snakes all over the place. So it's not very unlikely that in a place like India, that if you live here for a stretch of time, you end up seeing things. And one of the things that you end up seeing is the rope trick, because he offered a reward to any Indian magician who could perform the rope trick, and nobody came up, nobody could perform the trick, so he was convinced that the trick doesn't exist. As a result of it, he says that the rope trick doesn't exist, and he wrote a piece in The Listener and the Blackwood magazine stating that the rope trick doesn't exist. It has been conclusively proven because it offered a reward. The reward is of £500, but not a single Indian magician could come up, perform the trick, and claim the reward for himself. So that proves that it doesn't exist. And when he interviewed a large number of people in the process, he says that in the interviews, what people actually recount is what might have happened when they were children, what might have happened to them when they were very young. So there's a strong possibility they're imagining things. They've heard about things in their childhood. They're imagining that it actually happened. They've heard about it so many times, they're imagining that it might have happened. But, you know, in spite of all this, in spite of the fact that the myth of the Mystic East became a very popular book during the time of its publication, and Robert Henry Elliot was held in high regard by his fellow physicians and the scientists of the day, the debate remains inconclusive. And there's a Scottish historian, Peter Lamont, who has written a book on this. It's a popular history book. If you are at leisure, if you find the book, read it. In fact, Peter Lamont has published a very large number of books and articles on magic. And he's written one article on Indian magic along with Crispin Bates called Conjuring India. And Peter Lamont says that he also came to India. He lived in India for a while. He traveled through the country in search of the rope trick in the 1990s. And he publishes the book in the early 2000s. He says that everything is in imagination. He says that in India, he went to Kerala, he found, and he marveled at the fact that people can climb up coconut trees at great speed and bring down coconuts without losing balance for even for a single second. And he said that all these things, along with a bit of imagination of Europeans and Americans who had been to India in the 19th century, gave rise to the myth of the rope trick. The funny thing is, the myth isn't dead. The myth isn't dead. I mean, while doing research, I found that some time back in the New York Times, in a review of one of the a very important book which came out on Indian magic and its globalization, written by an Australian called John Zabriskie. The book's titled Empire of Enchantment. In a review of the book, the reviewer, the review was published in New York Times, and it was published, I believe, around 2019, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe in 2021. The reviewer says that there are people who still believe that Indian magic is uncomparable. It doesn't have its equivalent from anywhere on earth, anywhere in Asia or Africa, because if you go to India, you can witness something like the Indian rope trick. This is one of the suggestions which the reviewer makes. It's a popular book, and it's a newspaper review. It doesn't have to be scientifically exact. It has to attract attention, but nonetheless, the moot point is the myth of India being the proverbial magical land persists. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for your great lecture.
Thank you. We really enjoyed it. Now the floor is open for questions. Do you have any questions? We will take 2 questions.
I have one query. Since you are talking of Gundas,
Sir, live judge.
You are talking of Gundas. So whether the post-independence period, whether you have written anything on Gundas, especially because I have dealt with number of things. The Bidhan Chandra Rai is cultivating Gundas, and Bangalir Ekmatro Dokan in College Street, Gopal Patha, because I have written one book where I have interviewed, there is a Gundas in Jadavpur area. His name was Bashu Gunda, but I have seen it. I was a little boy. So whether you can elaborate on the Gundas in the post-independence period.
You know, I have worked on Gundas of colonial period primarily because the context changes greatly, profoundly in the post-independence period. And here, Anastasia Piliavsky's work might be of some relevance because, I mean, the body of work that I've come across on Gundas of post-independence period almost necessarily tracks the rise of these people from local politics. And these would probably, and a typical Gunda would rise from
Sir, continue.
okay. All right. So I thought there's a question from me. Okay. So, all right. So what happens in the post-independence period is that Gundas rise with political patronage, and then they turn into politicians themselves. And Piliavsky's work cites many such cases. One such case she has studied in great detail, which is a present-day politician in Rajasthan of early 2000s. And there's Enru Chanches, who's worked on Jamshedpur, and he tracks the rise of Gundas due to the decline of industry and, of course, the politics of the place, the local politics.
There is one movie in Bengali, we call it Apan.
Oh yeah.
That was the story of this Kosbar of the. It is exclusively based on Gundas. There is a story. What is that? Mere Aap. In Bengali it is Apan.
Yeah.
There is a real story of.
I've watched it. I watched both the movies a long time ago, but I did watch both the movies. But the thing is, in the colonial context, the political patronage is missing till the time of the partition riots of 1946-47.
Yes.
That's the time when the transition takes place, when Gundas actually start coming into politics. And as Professor Das mentioned, Gopal Patha. Gopal Patha's rise from 1946 onwards was facilitated due to his connections with the high politicians of the period. Ram Chatterjee. So all these people, they rise with political patronage. That's the difference I noticed between Gundas of. Yes, sir.
I had a very simple question. This myth of rope trick, why does it prove to be so persistent? Because it seems you have shown that people have studied it, they show it doesn't exist, but it comes back. So why do people need to? Is it a need? Or is it a particular exoticization of India? Or is it fulfilling some need on their part? I have no idea. I had no idea firstly that anyone took it so seriously. So remarkable how much digging and research was done on how the people tried to study the Indian magic. Whatever their reasons, they did a very thorough study of it, so many of them. But I'm very struck by the last part where you say that it is still believed to exist, despite the fact it is proven it doesn't exist.
When the PC Sarkar have a very well-known musician, you know.
Okay.
A continuation to Professor Rangarajan's question, rope trick probably is not only a colonial creation, because if you read Jahangir's autobiography, Duzuki Jahangiri, he mentions about a group of magicians probably coming from eastern part of India. I don't know whether he specifically mentioned Bengal, where he mentions some of these magicians performing a rope trick. But I had another related question is that if you look at the way Indian magicians since colonial times have dressed, they have dressed in a particular way, the Indian Maharaja style, etc. Except of one or two rare exceptions. For instance, I could mention to you the name of the magician who used to call himself Roy the Mystic, a Bengali magician, who in 1948 in an exhibition, in a special exhibition before the then governor of Bengal, Sir Kailash Nath Kaju, dressed up in typically Bengali dhoti and kurta, saying that we are independent now, we no longer have to follow the tradition. So was it a sort of self-imposed colonialization? And in case of rope trick, was there a pre-colonial historical origin which somehow got morphed into into colonial tradition?
Okay, all right. I think I should answer these questions and take more questions. Yeah. Thank you for your questions, Professor Rangarajan and Shantanu. First, to answer Professor Rangarajan's question, what I witnessed happening through this interest of Westerners in Indian magic was the Orientalization of India as a magical land, and in order to historically contextualize it, one has to go back to the time of Enlightenment. Enlightenment pushed magic into the margin and turning it into a sort of popular entertainment. Before Enlightenment, magic was integral part of life. And from the time of Enlightenment, it becomes a show, it becomes entertainment which you can witness and in the exchange of a few coins. That makes a difference, and historians who work on the history of magic say that magic got dislocated from the west to the east towards the end of the 18th century. So the West had become, as Max Weber says, it had become more scientific. It had gotten rid of magic, but there had to be magic elsewhere. So magic was dislocated from the west to the east. Initially, it was dislocated on Egypt after Napoleon's conquest of Egypt. Then, slowly, the fancy was in Indian magic. Towards the end of the century, there was Japanese and Chinese magic also. But Japanese and Chinese magic couldn't compete with Indian magic because these were proper theatrical shows with props. And these were performances made in a slightly darkened room. As compared to that, the fancy with Indian magic grew because Indian magic was necessarily performed by itinerant magicians out in the public and in broad daylight. So there was nothing hiding in plain sight. I mean, it was all in front of you, and this man would perform something, the magician would perform something, and the magician had a very subversive presence in the sense that he would barely speak English, he would be very servile, but at the end of the day, he would practically strike a blow at the scientific consciousness of the Western viewer who was viewing him. So that was the thing. And the other thing which I noticed is that in Orientalism, in the book Orientalism, Edward Said talks about two kinds of Orientalist knowledge. One is what we are usually familiar with, the higher or the order of Orientalist knowledge, which is produced by people like Max Muller, who are scholarly, who work in institutions at the University of Oxford and such places. The other, which he calls, which he doesn't dwell upon in detail, is a lower order of Orientalist knowledge, which is made of what he calls these hearsays, myths, these little anecdotes published in popular magazines, which do not have the same reliability or the respectability which the higher order of knowledge has. And I found during my research that the West was creating the lower order of Orientalist knowledge about India with the help of Indian magic, with the construct of Indian magic. And that persists in the sense that very often when I've spoken on magic in the West, I have received questions from people in the audience who live and work there, mostly white Westerners, about modern day Indian saints, sadhus. Do they actually know magic? Because they have magical cure. They have magical cure for almost everything. They have a magical solution for, even domestic problems, apparently. So, are they the modern day Indian magicians? So that's the question that I often fail to answer. But it shows that the belief persists that India is a magical land, and there's something called Indian magic which cannot be explained by modern science. To answer Shantanu's question, from the end of the 19th century, a number of Indian magicians started traveling to the West from early 20th century. The earliest show by an Indian magician in the West was in 1813 in London, and it became an overnight sensation over there. The man was called Ramaswamy, whose name was anglicized into Ramosamy, and he lived the rest of his life in London. He was from southern part of India. He lived the rest of his life in London. He married a white British woman. He died over there in 1851, I suppose. Yeah, 1851, and he kept on putting on shows in England as well as other parts of Europe till about the 1840s, when he goes into a period of decline because he was aging. But towards the end of the 19th century, a number of magicians who were traveling from India to the West realized that they can, if they orientalize themselves with the robes and with the disguise, which their audiences expected them to have, it'll be easier for them to sell their magic. Many of them.
Subodh, can I ask a question?
Yes, please, sir.
Okay, well, first, thank you very much for a very interesting submission where you essentially tried to relate, if I could understand, between memory, speech, and magic. Now, in that context, do you think that folklore plays an important role in preserving the history of magical beliefs?
Folklore.
Yeah.
Yes, folklore would, sir, but I haven't exactly inquired much into this area. Thank you for your question. It becomes rather than folklore, what I would say that I can cite a few examples with this rope trick and how the myth was generated. It does become a part of family lore, not so much folklore in the sense that we know folklore, and the few books and articles which I have read on folklore.
Professor Das was suggesting folk tales. For instance, if you read
Lal
Bihari, there would be a lot of stories.
Folk tales would be full of magical tales. Yeah. In that way, yeah. Folklore would necessarily be.
If you go to actually some of the Bengali folk tales, there are a lot of references to the mythical beliefs which get perpetrated in the memory cycle.
And
So
print
that-
becomes a medium. Yeah.
And that would be an interesting area of interjection where you try to develop a relationship between memory, myth and magic.
Definitely, definitely. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah. Definitely, sir. Okay.
Thank you for this wonderful lecture. And this is Devashish. I have a small query. During the colonial period, we know that some tribes are termed as a criminal tribe, something like that, some communities also. So what are the British policies, I mean, why they are, I mean, is this stigma or some kind of policies, or, I mean, what is the actual the background, what is the reality? Can you enlighten?
See, this falls beyond the purview of my talk, but I will try and answer it very briefly. The established literature, I haven't worked on criminal tribes. I would answer the question with the help of secondary readings, which I've gone through. What happens in 1870s is that we have the Criminal Tribes Act. It was modeled after the Habitual Criminals Act, which had been, which was a new law drafted in the early 1860s in England. And the Criminal Tribes Act basically aimed to demilitarize, sedentarize nomadic people in India. It had the twin purpose, it would serve the twin purpose of first reducing the perceived threat to British Empire in India, because if there are people who are armed and who are nomadic, they can pose a threat to the British in India. And the second thing is, from the 1870s, there's a drive to maximize land revenue. So if you settle people and centralize them in a certain area and they become agriculturists, it eventually helps the British government in maximizing revenue. So that's the thing. And there's one thing that I would like to add over here. There was a criminal tribe called the Sansis, who were known, who I have seen a few records, who were known to practice magic. And they were known as thieves, habitual thieves. So use their magic to kind of steal. So, I think she had a question. She had raised her hand for quite some time, but I couldn't really answer the question. Yeah.
Okay.
Hello sir, I am Shreya Mondal. I'm a PhD scholar in history at Shiv Nadar University. Thank you for your talk. This was like a very, very rare topic that I've heard of. And I have one comment and one curiosity almost. So I was thinking the way you said magic, Indian magic, so-called Indian magic, was fetishized in the colonial market. I was thinking it goes with the same line how the curse of the pyramid was marketed in Europe as like parallelly when these same tombs were robbed of its artifacts, and these stories of curse and how archaeologists were dying were spread in the market, was sold, and then it was redacted within a month saying that it's a false story. But by that time the market was like full of it. So people were funding more and more to send the archaeologists back to the pyramids. Yeah, so I was thinking that, and I wanted to ask, so did you come across the practices of hallucinations in while you were talking about magic and in your work?
Practices of hallucination. The one place in which the theme of hallucination appears time and again, is the debate on the rope trick. Now, people who said that who witnessed the rope trick were attacked by their detractors, who in turn said that you were hallucinating, and it was an act of mass hypnotism. Hypnotists who performed their craft on stages in front of audiences in the West very often say that you can hypnotize 1 or 2 people at a time, but not like 50 or 100 people or 200 people flocked around you. That's impossible. And so the theme of hallucination comes up time and again. And interestingly, Robert Henry Eliot uses this term hallucination in his book Myth of the Mysticist, and he says that people who were there and given the weather given the heat, given the dust, given the moisture, and given the kind of monsoon that we have, given the flora and fauna of this place, it's not very unlikely for a Westerner to go to the east and to start hallucinating. So the theme of hallucination comes up over there, but it's not so much to do with what the Indian magician was doing. He wasn't, he wasn't hallucinating, and his audience, many of whom were Westerners who were very conscious of the fact that they were watching something, and they were going to take back the experiences to their country and publish books and articles about it. They most certainly weren't hallucinating. But the only place where the theme comes up is what I told you.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
Now I would invite for this panel discussion session, Professor Pradeep Chakravarti will chair this session. So I would like to invite you, please come on the dais, sir.
Yeah.
Yes. And for felicitation of our sir, beloved sir, Ma'am Professor Ruby Sen, please come and felicitate sir. No, always. Sir. Thank you, ma'am. So now I would like to introduce our panelists. This panel discussion on the theme of understanding myths and reality in historical studies and in and around. So I would like to invite our panelist, Dr. Nisha Thakur, Head and Assistant Professor, Department of History, Adamas University. Dr. Thakur, our panelist, Dr. Nisha Thakur, Head and Adamas University. So second is Dr. Vasudita Vasu, Assistant Professor, Department of History, Adamas University. She has also been awarded PhD from Center for Historical Studies, JNU, and she has joined, I think, in 2023 this university. And the third, our former colleague, now she is in Panchkut Mahavidyalaya, Dr. Subhajit Haldar, Assistant Professor, Department of History, Panchkut Mahavidyalaya, Purulia, West Bengal. And Subhajit Haldar is also awarded PhD from Center for Historical Study, JNU. And yeah, so I would like to invite Ruby ma'am to felicitate three of our panelists. Yeah.
The chair is not the issue.
And the moderator also.
Yeah, he himself is from JNU.
She and this moderator Yeah, yes.
So you were the first teacher that I got.
Yeah.
MA also.
Yeah, MA over there, sir.
Next to you.
I think our audience are feeling sleepy and I don't think so. After having lunch, yeah, it's a struggling time for us. Speaker. It's a powerful. Thank you so much, ma'am. Now, I would request all panelists, you have 10 minutes time. Each panelist will have 10 minutes time to speak about their topics, and please be seated, every panelist. So, yeah.
So, thank you very much, Nirdosh sir, for organizing this workshop and having this panel where the faculties of the department are also getting a chance to say. I will not be taking much of your time because I believe I'm not really very expert person to be, talking about methodology, which I myself is now learning, in a process. So I will just share how I have done my research and the book that is going to be published very soon. So what methodology did I use for that? So it is very integral to the Indian knowledge system and the very concept that is growing. And in my career here, I have seen that from being a historian, I have, since I have an ancient history degree, I have become an exponent of Indian knowledge system. So why this is happening, I have just a few things to say. So India's tradition of legal and philosophical history, why I am saying legal is because we often say that is right and Acharya, Upadhyay. So in the philosophical writings, this is certainly unparalleled in its continuity and depth, from the Vedas to the Smritis, from Bhashya and Nibandhas. I will tell you what Bhashya and Nibandha means. So Sanskrit knowledge system production has often unfolded through a recursive journey of commentary and interpretation that makes the Indian writing and thinking very unique in comparison to other parts of the world. So recent changes in the university curricula, particularly the inclusion of the knowledge system, Indian knowledge system, especially in the law schools, management programs and technical institutes, it reflects a growing effort of recovery and valorizing India's intellectual past. The very question that was asked to the second speaker about one of the historians is a very important thing one has to notice. So texts such as the Arthashastra, Manusmriti, Abhasmriti and many other Smritis, they are now being taught not only as a historical curiosity but as a repository of wisdom. So underlying thrust is a sincere one, obviously to reconnect the modern India's institutions with its ancient epistemes. Yet as this institutional revival proceeds, it becomes essential to critically assess which knowledge systems are being celebrated and which histories are being neglected. The question is not whether Shastra deserves attention, it certainly does, but rather how it should be read. A recent song lyric that encapsulates the uncritical reverence often attached to this archive. वेदों में लिखा है और ग्रंथों में लिखा, सबने ये पढ़ा है और सबको है पता. So it is written, obviously, like most of you would understand, that this cultural echo underlines how deeply scriptural authority remains embedded in the moral and legal imagination of the Indian society. But this universal tone masks the significant exclusion that the classical archive enshrines, particularly in relation to caste and gender. Now, I move to the area to which I have done my research, that is Mithila, the northern part of Bihar, the modern state Bihar. It's actually a cultural zone where a lot of Maithils belong, but mostly Maithil Brahmins have lived there through many centuries. So in this context, the exclusion is very evident in the legal literatures of Mithila, particularly the works of Chandeshwar Thakur. I'm sure most of you have not heard of him, and Vachaspati Mishra. If you are a law student, you would definitely hear about them. Most of whom wrote influential Nibandha, that is digest and commentary text, from the 13th century onwards. For example, in Chandeshwar's very popular celebrated writing in Mithila, Vivad Ratnakar, he asserts that the dharma of women is indeed bound up in the service of the husband. He further declares that a woman's right to property is conditional, precarious, and almost always secondary to male kin. Regarding immoral conduct, he also writes that women are not sharer of brothers in inheritance. A fallen woman merits expiations, not property. Similarly, on the Shudras, his prescriptions are even more rigid. The Shudras, for example, he writes that the Shudras has no right to perform the dharma, he must serve the higher varnas. This vision of social order is echoed and reinforced in the jurisprudence of Vachaspati Mishra, who writes his treatise much later than Chandeshwar Thakur. In his Vyavahar Prakash, he moralizes gender roles with statements such as, gentle speech adorns a woman. He emphasizes that customary laws that are called Lokacharya cannot override the Shastras. He also writes that local customs, if contrary to Shastra, holds no authority. Such statements codify in epistemology that delegitimizes regional, oral, and non-Brahminical sources of law, thereby shrinking the local legal universe to a narrow Sanskritic model. Even progressive Smriti interpretations like those of Jimudwana, that is very integral to Bengal's law history, the Abhag, shows this selective logic. Although the Abhag expanded inheritance right of widows, justifying them not by right but by ritual utility, for which it is very celebrated in Bengal, it remains within the same Brahminical framework, privileging Shraddha or Shraddh performance as the key to legitimacy. This contrasts with the more rigid Mitakshara school of Mithila, very near to Bengal but culturally very different, Vijneshwara found, but it does not transcend its casteist and gendered assumptions. Despite these exclusions, the classical archives also contain moments of dissent and complexity. For example, Vidyapati, I'm sure most of you know about Vidyapati because he is very famous in Bengal and obviously in other parts of India now for his love songs. But he's a prolific writer. He has written a lot of other kind of works. In one of the works called Purusha Pariksha, which is a Niti Kavya attributed to him, invokes a radically moralized vision of kinship. Without dharma, he says, and knowledge, kinship cannot proceed. The cry of the suffering must be heard. This line recenters the legitimacy of power on moral sensitivity and popular justice, concepts often marginal in juridical Shastra. A historically grounded approach to Indian legal history must therefore go beyond Sanskrit canon. Regional customs, that is called Deshacharya, caste panchayat records, and in my context the genealogical records, vernacular legal manuals, oral traditions, and temple land disputes offer alternative archives. In medieval Mithila, for instance, customary law transfers were regulated not by Shastra but by the Panji genealogical records, caste exogamy norms, and local juridical memory. The Purush Pariksha of Vidyapati, while framed as a courtly Niti Kavya, repeatedly invokes moral deliberations grounded in real-world dilemmas. So, to conclude, the work of historians, particularly dealing with legal histories, must involve more than textual analysis. It must ask who had the authority to define the law, what was right and what is wrong, whose voices were excluded by dominant archive, what kind of knowledge were disqualified because they were not written in Sanskrit, not authored by Brahmins, and not preserved in the palm leaf manuscripts. So thank you very much. I look forward to the questions.
No, we will have
at the end of
the second one, Dr. Vasudita Vasu.
Got 3 minutes additional. We have finished in 7 minutes.
Thank you for the 3 minutes addition. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, respected dignitaries, faculties, and all the esteemed guests present over here. I take the opportunity to thank Professor Suranjan Das and Dr. Nirdosh Kumar for giving me this opportunity. Now, before I begin my discussion, let me introduce my topic. I work on the history of sports. So it will be a bit difficult for me to sum up the tale of 6 years rather, 4 years of my PhD and 2 years of my book, which is coming up recently from Primus, to tell the entire tale in 10 minutes. But I'll try my best. Now, sports has been an unconventional topic of research, we all know. But what I have tried my best to use several conventional sources to talk about this unconventional topic. Now, before discussing about my methodology, it is important for us to ascertain what is sports, not only for me, but for the society. This inevitably brings me to the point where I, along with my other fellow sports historians, never separate sports history with social history. Sports have been embedded in the larger debates of nationalism, nation building, imperialism, education, and also women emancipation and gender. I was never concerned about the evolution of a particular sports because that has been wonderfully dealt by Professor Kaushik Bandyopadhyay and Professor Borio Mujumdar, Ranojay Sen and others. Rather, what I tried to figure out was how sports in Bengal was embedded in the larger debates of socio-political aspect, how it was linked to the larger global issues, which after my submission, I have probed into it. My work explored the interrelation among Western education, physical culture, and colonial policies in Bengal. So through an innovative case study of the physical education curriculum, I broadened the scope of the extensive body of work on British colonial policies in Bengal. I argued that sports is not only a leisure, but it is an essential agent of social control and change. Sports' relationship with nationalism and communalism, I previously mentioned, that has been already probed into. However, my work analyzes the rationale behind the British administrators in introducing physical education and sports in the schools and colleges of Bengal. So I have tried to address several important questions through my research. That how were modern sports and physical education used to implement imperial ideology in colonial Bengal? How did ideology, in turn, pave the way for the vertical and horizontal diffusion of modern codified sports? What I think is important is to understand how modern sports reflect the varied meaning of race, religion, the native body, nation, and community. Lastly, it probed to what extent gender defined the sporting field. Now, how did it all start? How is my source different from my fellow sports historians? I started seeing over the sources from the Proceeding of Home Department, Education Branch of National Archives. Generally, previously when I was doing sports history, many scholars, many teachers asked me that how will you make it more historical in nature? How is your work different from a journalist's work? So it all started with the proceedings of Home Department, Education Branch from the National Archives. And very interestingly, we always try to make sports and education studies very different from one another. But when I was literally on the verge of losing hope that I won't be able to get any source, I started getting the sources actually from the Education Department. So here, why sports was included in the Education Department? It was in the beginning, from 1880s I saw that Education Department was started adding sports to their moral education portion. So here again I reinterpreted. I saw that along with moral education, sports was used in the schools as a or you can say tool of discipline. Here again I have reinterpreted discipline based on my sources. What I have argued is that disciplined students were the ones who were loyal to the administrators. At that point of time, we are seeing that there were lots of insolent activities which the students were doing in the colleges. Many of them were taking part in the secret societies, which was not very conducive for the British administration. As a result of which they wanted disciplined students. And discipline over here was nothing but loyal students to the English administrators. The discipline which the British tried to enforce was similar to the discipline propounded by Michel Foucault, who discusses the change in the form of punishment in prison. Here, in the school, they tried to shift the focus of punishment from the body as the immediate and direct target of exercise to the soul. Thus, Shatatru Sen writes, what we see in colonial India at this point of time is a highly developed and intensely politicized pedagogy of the body. Thus, what I have argued is that the administrator tried to use physical education in tandem with moral education to inculcate discipline and loyalty among the student. To bring in a comparison with the students of the metropole, I have seen several journals and school reports like the school magazines of Harrow, Eton, Health and Strength monthly reports, and Sandoz magazine, which are housed in the British Library, National Archives, Kew and Wellcome Trust Library. All of them are talking about sports in the metropole as a tool to make a stoic, good administrator. But when the same thing is happening over here, we are seeing the ideology is different. Here, the students were, were hammered, the body of the students were hammered to be much more loyal. Now, I had this question in mind that why the students were introduced to sports when none of the students from Bengal were actually taken into the Bengal regiment or into the British. They were not taken as soldiers because they were considered to be effeminate. Here also I saw that several documents are talking about that they should be made much more loyal so that they become better clerks, because they were the one who were acting, they were working in some of the companies for the sustenance of the empire. I'll just take 2 more minutes. Now, what were the sources? When I talk about sports, I also talk about gendered perspectives of sport. What were the sources for studying sports history or women's sports history? When we are talking about women's sports history, we are seeing that these sources are completely different. They are not talking about, they were not concerned about how loyal the women students were. More than archival material, now the materials were housed in newspapers, where the Bhadraloks themselves were telling that they should educate their women, they should tell their women to take part in sports, and that too some of the sports which were more feminine in nature, so that their bodies become much more better to bear children. So these were some of the sources which I have seen, and the sources, obviously the nature of sources changed, but because of the paucity of time I couldn't conclude. Thank you so much.
Now I'm asking Dr. Subhajit Haldar, please come.
First of all, I would like to thank Professor Suranjan Das for giving me the opportunity to speak in front of you, and I would also like to thank the Department of History for inviting me. Now, I'll talk about, let us think about a globalized world where four things are very important: roti, kapda, makan, and the last thing is naukri. So, Naukri is not available, so let us not talk about Naukri. And I don't know anything about Kapra and Makan, so I will not talk about it. I will talk about food. Let us first start with Rabindranath Tagore, our very own. While talking about Bharatbarsher Itihas, I will read it in Bengali because I don't have the audacity to translate it, but I will just brief it. In ভারতবর্ষের ইতিহাস, রবীন্দ্রনাথ ঠাকুর has written that তখনকার দুর্দিনেও এই কাটাকাটি খুনোখুনি যে ভারতবর্ষের প্রধানতম ব্যাপার তাহা নহে। ঝড়ের দিনে যে ঝড়ই সর্বপ্রধান ঘটনা তাহা তাহার গর্জন সত্ত্বেও স্বীকার করা যায় না। সেদিনও সেই ধূলিমাচ্ছন্ন আকাশের মধ্যে পল্লী গৃহে গৃহে যে জন্ম মৃত্যু সুখ দুঃখের প্রবাহ চলিতে থাকে তাহা ঢাকা পড়িলেও মানুষের পক্ষে তাহাই প্রধান। কিন্তু বিদেশি পথিকের কাছে এই ঝড়ই প্রধান। এই ধূলিকণাই তাহার চক্ষে আর সমস্তই গ্রাস করে, কারণ সে ঘরের ভিতর নাই, সে ঘরের বাইরে। সেই জন্য বিদেশের ইতিহাসে এই ধূলিকণার কথা ঝড়ের কথাই পাই, ঘরের কথা কিছুমাত্র পাই না। So basically he was trying to talk about the emphasize on the social structure and social history of India rather than the political history of India. That was his intention. So if you look at the society, food is one of the important thing for a human being to survive. So in a way, what has happened is that let us now look at how the food history has started. If you look at the formal beginning of food history, it has started with the emergence of French scholars called annals schools. Prior to the World War II, there was a huge change in society in Europe, and people were very frustrated. So they were trying to look at food and other societal norms in a different way. What has happened is that while the World War II was happening, this thing was going on. Initially, if we look at it, we can see that Marc Bloch and Lucien Febvre, both of them in their work, they have emphasized on the importance of food and food consumption because they were looking at the society in a holistic way, and they were there emphasized on basically the society. What has happened is that during the mid 20th century, what has happened? They have tried to called for a new way of researching, and they were trying to work on the food history. So what has happened is that during that period, we can observe there is another historian who is basically J.S. Flannery. He has come up and he has worked on the food history in detail. In his work, if you look at it, you can observe that in his work he has emphasized on the food and the choices, how people choose their food and how is it available to them, how their taste work, how they how the society try to kind of choose their food and their taste. The taste evolved. That is basically his whole work. After that, the food history basically changed when they have started the journal Food and Food Waste, where they have introduced the new way of thinking, and they have introduced the multidisciplinary approach towards the food history. So that is the thing. With that, we can observe that the food history was basically took its shape. Later on, we can also observe that there are other school of historians who have also used in their work the food as a indicator of the day-to-day life. If you look at the British history, E.P. Thompson's work, you can also observe the importance of potato and so on. So that is there. Now, if you look at the world perspective, there are not only historians, there are anthropologists like Sidney Means, and there are sociologists, Stephen Meynell and so on. They have extensively worked. There are other multiple people who have extensively worked on the food history. Now let us come to India, where I belong and on which I have worked on. So initially, if you look at the food history, you can see that initially the food history was not a separate discipline, and sociologists used to work on the food habits. Sociologists and anthropologists, as part of their work, they used to work on food. Interestingly, when the historians like R.C. Majumdar and others, they have started writing about the history of Bengal and so on, you can observe that while talking about the Bengali society, they were talking about their food habits of Bengal. Later on, we can observe there are multiple debates which has been there on food. This is going as a historical, this is basically going as a historical trend in India. But during that time also, food history was not properly established. The proper, in a sense, the dictionary of food was introduced by a Tamil, I think he was Tamil Brahmin, K.T. Achaya, if I'm not wrong. So he introduced he has basically written the handbook of, I think that is the dictionary of food, Indian food or something like that. So with that, we can observe there is a process which has started to basically create a dictionary for food and their origins, how they work and so on. So that is there, and after that there are many people who have started in case of Bengal. If you look at the books, like Utsha Rai has written a book which is published from Cambridge University Press. There are Ishita Banerjee Dubey and so on. They have also written about the food history. Now let us come to another section, the methodology of food history. I will talk about it. I have 3 minutes and then I will conclude. What has happened is that food history is basically, food history, if you look at it, it has basically, if you have to do the food history, you have to look at it in a multidisciplinary approach. History, anthropology, archaeology, sociology, cultural studies, you have to use of all this approach. Only then you can actually do the food history in a proper way. Now what will be your sources or source? Basically, we can observe in terms of Bengal, cookbooks have started appearing from 1830s, from Bardhaman Rajbari, and then from the early 19th century, early 20th century, there is a huge arena of cookbooks which have appeared, because some of them actually Boshutita has talked about, because of the schools, they have basically in their curriculum the food and cooking and is there, so that is also they are talking about it. And the cookbooks, agricultural manuals, travelogue, I have 2 minutes, I know, I'll conclude. Travelogue, diaries, menus, everything is also there, and more importantly, the oral history, from where you can observe that from there you can unearth the lost recipes, the lost lores about food, lost, more or less lost rituals regarding food, you can unearth that. There is another thing which is basically very important for ancient Indian food history, which is archaeology, ancient and medieval Indian food history precisely, because from archaeology you can understand the seeds, bones, pollens and residues from there. Even the kitchen utensils you can find out. If you look at the Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, and you can see the kitchen utensils and the furnace, from there you can kind of unearth the kind of food they used to consume. You can have a glimpse. It is not a very clear-cut history of like colonial period, but you can have a kind of understanding. Then the literary and religious text, modern media and popular culture, and so on. So in this way, if you look at and if you use the methodology and use these kind of sources, you can have a very good food history. The 10 minutes is over. Thank you so much.
Now I would like to invite Professor Tridib Chakraborty to make comments as a chair.
So 3 excellent papers. First of all, what Nisha have discussed, he has discussed the ancient Indian history based on Dharma Shastra Neti. I'm just summarizing the interpoints. Boshodita is talking about sports history, and Shubhajit is talking about what he have delivered, that is food history. Now, since the topic is something related to methodology and the methods of historical studies, so I do not find any methodology, what methodology they have followed. Actually, only stray comments they have made. Actually, that's my own observation. And thing is that nowadays, because of the globalization and other scientific method, when we have done our PhD, we have to write pages after pages. Now everything is available. And the current student trend is not to go library, they have to collect it from the internet. How the internet sources are good or bad, God knows. Now, this is the point. Actually, if you want to write a good work, you have to go to library. You have to find out. You have to find out, you have to give a new dimension of your, because a lot of things, one topic, number of scholars have written. But you have to write something which will be quite innovative. And from the morning session, what our Vice Chancellor and the guest speaker have delivered, what Shantanu have delivered, we have to learn from it, that how to do a serious research, not to copy and paste. And I can tell you, which I have experienced myself, there is a book written by, since my domain is on international relations, Southeast Asia, I have received a book from Singapore National University. That book I have to review. That is the book on the Sophie Quinninger's book, the Ho Chi Minh, the missing years from 1919 to 1939. And that book was sponsored by US government. Officially, they wanted to defend Ho Chi Minh. And unfortunately, I got that book. And at the end part of the book, the Sophie Quinninger say that Ho Chi Minh was not the real leader. He became hero by ditching number of other important leaders. They're very controversial. So there in the one point I have mentioned, and he tried to prove all the documents which when the Soviet Union archive was opened. Now my opinion is that not archival documents are not always authentic. Because someone have arrested, police have arrested, then they have placed it in the, suppose someone have arrested me, then you have to take down the note, down the lines, what is your name, father's name, etc. Then he kept it in the document. Then I escaped, then I became relieved. But that document will be kept in the archive. So that is not authentic. So that's a controversial thing. So I have a request to all of you, those who have joined, you should do a serious research. And last point, which I have to enrich myself, he said Roti Kapra Makan by Shubhajit. I have added, and he have mentioned Nokri. I have added 2 more. One is mobile, another is AI. Thank you very much.
So we will take one question for each panelist. One question for each panelist due to the shortage of time. So So the question answer round is open. One question for each panelist. Yeah, please.
Can I ask a question for Subhajit?
Yeah, yes, sir, sure.
Subhajit, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for this interesting paper. I was wondering, I read somewhere that food can be used both as a tool of political power as well as a tool of resistance. How would you react to that? And in the context of your research that you are doing, do you think that food can be used both as a political power as well as for resistance?
Yes, sir, thank you for the question. Yes, sir, it is. I mean, for centuries, food have been used for political powers, and food have been used for resistance. If you look at, I mean, in Bengal's context, food as a resistance. Let me respond to the resistance part first. If you look at the resistance part, you can observe that the caste resistance were basically based on, I mean, a major portion was basically based on food. Let me give you some instance. Like if you look at the Young Bengal movement, they used to use the food, I mean the bones, and they used to throw it in the temples. Not only that, there is a very interesting story how fear and resistance basically working together. If you look at Rajnarayan Basu's work, Sekal and Ekal, he was talking about that period when these Young Bengal people were working. If you look at that time, you can observe that there is a story that there are three friends from our elite college. They were standing in front of a biscuit shop, and they were discussing among themselves who can go and fetch some biscuit. Now, interestingly, that shop is maintained, I mean, maintained by a Muslim person. So, if they enter and have, I mean, buy that biscuit and someone see, then they will face major consequences. So, what has happened? They were discussing for several days, and after a point, there was a person who entered the shop. They bring out the biscuit, they have it, and they were like, "Hooray! We break all the shackles of caste." There is another thing. Rajnarayan Basu himself, he wrote that while taking the Brahmo religion, I had biscuit as a resistance against the caste norms, because during that period biscuits were basically produced by Muslim members. So that is the resistance part. There are other section, there are political resistance also, but I have not focused on that part, political part very much, so that someone has to look at. Now the power, how you can use power. If you look at the rationing system, it is basically the government's government is basically giving certain things, and in return they want something. Like if you look at the present situation also, after pandemic, the government is giving 80 lakh people, I think more than 80 lakh or something, 800 million people are basically living on the ration. So, and if you look at it, some political party leaders' picture was basically posted on the bags where they are giving ration. So it is basically a form of inserting power. So that is my response. I think I have answered, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Subhajit. Thank you.
We'll take another question from two panelists. Anyone? Yeah. Apart from Subhajit.
Hello. Hello, I'm Dr. Subhashish from Department of Political Science. I just want to add a new perspective, how Subhajit has analyzed his perspective. Subhajit, I just want to give a new perspective. You can work on that. Suranjan sir has asked you about political power, right? So, what do you think that being India, we could use our food as a important mechanism of soft power, right? If you study the work of Joseph Nye, who has died very recently. So don't you think it is our inability to that we are not promoting our food all across the globe? If we want to identify India as a soft power tool, we could easily connect India with its food culture, right? So why can't you think from that perspective?
Yeah, I should be very brief. Actually, the answer should be that I don't work on that area. It is basically the colonial period on which I am working on. So that is beyond my purview, and rest we will discuss later because I don't have time.
So another one question. Huh? So thank you everyone. Yeah, please, sir, please. Sorry.
One question to you is, during colonialism, as printing press arrived in India, and it proliferated, apart from general textbooks, etc., many of these old manuscripts would also be printed, and you would have numerous writing of local presses, be it Bengali, be it Maithili, etc. Some of these books would be printed, etc. To what extent, I mean, would there be, in your opinion, what was the impact of that largely in society? Because with printing, did the idea of these manuscripts existing, would the number of people who would be reading these manuscripts, did they increase, and did they create any sort of major social impact? As for you, I have one query because, food of course can be discussed and researched in multiple abstract ways. Sometimes right? Yeah, you need to majority of research related to food history has essentially involved study of cookbooks, how these, but there hasn't been much study on emergence of new type or new style eateries which came up in major towns and cities of India. Sometimes traditional, some were, offers a sort of mixed cuisine, and people increasingly came to eat. For instance, if you look at the eateries, the cafes and restaurants based in Calcutta here, not much has been written about that. I don't know how much study has been done on Iranian cafe culture in Bombay. I don't know whether how much research has been done on that. And regarding sports history, the focus is on modern schools, etc., were more on sports that had arrived from Europe. In case of our own cultural traditions, etc., you had individuals like Guru Sadai Dutt who tried to bring it through with Brotachari movement. And then, of course, when you had indigenized versions of the Boy Scouts movement here, Sri Ram Bajpai and others, they also tried to reintroduce some of these traditional sports, etc. Would your research focus much on that?
Thank you for the question. Due to the paucity of time, I couldn't explain it. Actually, the Western sports which was introduced in India or in Bengal comes later. First, the indigenous version of Dehu Charcha is coming, Hindu Mela, and the British themselves have, they have talked about the indigenous sports like Kumir Bhumir, Keet. There were lots of sports which was indigenous. Even David Carley had also written about the Indian sports. So this is the thing which we always think that the British first brought the Western sports in our school, introduced it. It comes later. First, the Deho Charcha thing is coming. After that, they wanted to take agency over the sports. Again, the thing is changing when Boy Scout is introduced. Because along with White Scouts, Brotachari movement was also introduced. They did not want that because that was becoming militarized. So sports history has lots of layers to it, and yes, I'm incorporating all of them in my research. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for the question. Actually, what has happened is that there are certain articles, very scattered articles, which are there on Bombay. There is, I think, 1 or 2 Bengali articles on, Bengali kind of journalistic article, because now food in popular culture is there and everyone is writing about food. If you look at Facebook, WhatsApp messages, so, and everywhere you can see that there are multiple books have been published which are on books. They have touched upon these areas, but no serious study has been incorporated, and I'm thinking about it, but actually the problem is that source.
I can, just to give you one example, you must have heard about Bhim, the famous sweet shop of Bhimna. One colleague of mine have some contacts with their family. Now, they were lamenting that probably the next generation is not that much interested. And probably, he says, another 20-30 years this might get closed down. And he was saying that we still have a lot of family documents, etc. If someone comes in, studies this, we could have a good old family history, and also which could also be a part.
Yes, sir, that is true, sir. But what has happened is that first of all, you need the context, which I don't have access. But one thing I can say that Bengalis have lot of historical materials, so they don't want to preserve anything. For instance, if you look at the Great Eastern Hotel, they have a very good bakery before, in the colonial period. But when the ownership changes, they have basically throw it out everything, including the menus. So you don't have anything on that eatery except, even if you look at the Farbo, which is everywhere in the writings of Britishers, Indians. Sir, I think have also, during your childhood, I think a Farbo is there. But there is not if you go to internet or anywhere, you can't find any even proper picture of Farbo.
There are some menu cards
are available, yes, sir.
But that goes
I
into
don't.
1930s.
Yes, sir, and I don't know whether sir, whether those are genuine or not, because I have seen some which is going around in internet, but genuinity is a challenge too. Because now with AI and with Photoshop you can generate anything. So that is also a problem to write about these things. But, yes. Within 10 years we have to do this, because that generation will pass if we don't take, because the oral tradition will also, so that is the thing.
Even I face the same problem, because I remember Hindustan Motors, which is there in Howrah, they have sponsored a lot, and they have patronized football a lot. The Howrah Club is one of them. But when I asked for their documentation, they said that no, আমার বাবা কোনো কিছু দেখিয়ে করতো না, ঢুকিয়ে করতো. So this concept has been there.
Thank you, sir, for the question. You talked about the printing press. That is really very important, especially in the context of Mithila, because I'll give you one example of Hari Prasad Shastri, who was compiling all the Sanskrit sources in Eastern India, including Nepal and otherwise. So he wrote a very interesting thing in the introduction, which actually made me very interested in the area. He says that around 40% of the Sanskrit sources, which are very important to understand India's history, they were compiled in Mithila by the Maithil Brahmins. After that, when Suniti Kumar Chatterjee edited the Varna Ratnagar, and Vidyapati was people came to know about, because of Grierson and others, they came to know about Vidyapati, that he was not a Bengali scholar. He was a Maithil, and he belonged to a tradition which was very unique, not really Bengali. Shyama Sastri and others. So it was very interesting, very important. At the same time, sir, it also showed that how elite these practices were. And when they talked about region, the incorporation of all the people who are not really reflected in this text. So especially women, because I believe I am the only woman who has worked on Mithila so far. I have not come across any woman who is writing a work on Mithila using these sources. Because of the the very peculiar nature of these texts, they are very integral in the regional context, genealogies. So uncoding it is very difficult. So it does have a very important impact. So printing is very important.
Thank you everyone. Now there is a 5-minute tea break. I know you all are feeling sleepy. So just 5 minutes.
Just 5-minute tea break, and then the last lecture, I'm just telling you, the last lecture on the fundamentals of research design by me would be after it. So just 5-minute break, and then you return back soon.
Thank you.